hand up I know is a liar. I don't trust you. Go fuck yourself. You're tacky and I hate you. In classic video game industry delusion, some of the executives here at the higher level of the studios behind King of Meat were expecting this game to be pulling 100,000 concurrent players, but unfortunately, reality was a cruel mistress. She came through and slapped the fuck out of them. They couldn't even get a tiny whiff of 4 digits because this game peaked at 320 during a free weekend. King of Meat is typically a $30 game.
They've made it halfway!
No matter the
Stop
odds,
them! There's still a chance to stop them!
So cold.
They hit a checkpoint! Now might be a good time to stop them.
Don't mess with the amazing Spider-Man!
Better stop that vehicle!
Some assistance, please.
Better stop that vehicle!
Cosmic might returns. Our enemies are near. I can feel them.
It's now or never! Stop them!
Quantum Matrix. Appreciate it. Leave them to crush you. Healing power. The Cosmos heals you.
Give them another
Never miss.
or else.
I am ready to put on a show.
After my step. This time I need healing. Stronger together. Tandy needs help. Healing power. I am at your service. Love battlefield medicine.
Everybody needs a hand sometimes. Or a therapist.
The Cosmos heals you.
Feels like the spirit
Cosmic light
just
returns.
faded away.
Place out. Don't mess with the amazing Spider-Man! I have risen. My favorite time! Extermination! Born again! Some assistance, please. Healing power. Second chances open. I'd be a strong man. You would not mourn me, but I will.
You get a weapon! You get a weapon! You get a weapon! Spider
Cosmos heals you.
I'll get you next time. Everybody needs a hand sometimes. Or a therapist.
One of Strange's portals. Watch your backs.
I am ready to put on a show.
After my step. Shield. How nice. Don't mess with the amazing Spider-Man! I require some aid. Leave them to crush you. I am at your service.
Hey! Some love over here!
Take everything!
Gone. Exterminate!
Well, you can't expect to win them all. You're a top-notch team to win this one.
What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about all of the announcement highlights from last night's The Game Awards. Bringing with it, as always, a host of announcements, world premieres, that kind of thing, and if you're the kind of person who wants to see just those, you may not want to watch a 3-hour plus show. However, this year's show was pretty decent, all things considered, and there is certainly some interesting stuff to go over here, as I, of course, prep my own content and plans for next year in terms of video games. However, to get this started, just to address the elephant in the room, Divinity was announced at the Game Award. If you follow this channel at all, you may well be aware that Divinity is one of my favorite franchises ever. I absolutely love it. Yes, I will be covering it individually in its own video. You're going to see that about an hour from the time this one drops, so if you're watching this past like 7 a.m. Central, that video should already be out and you can watch all my thoughts on that there. Probably not going to be released anytime soon, but absolutely pumped for that. My single most anticipated game now. Before we jump into it, just a word on the actual awards themselves. For the most part, more or less what I expected. Expedition 33 won most everything. While it wouldn't have been my personal choice for a lot of them, it is in fact a great game, so I get it. I did see that Doom won, which I was really happy to see. If you played Doom the Dark Ages, they did a tremendous amount of work to make that game approachable for everyone, and I'm glad to see that that was rewarded appropriately. That's about all the thoughts I have on the actual awards themselves, though. Moving on to the announcement highlights. First up, and we're going in mostly chronological order from the time of when the show started to when it finished, by the way, so no particular order otherwise. But kicking it off with Decrepit, coming out in 2026. This game seems to be a blending of first-person Souls-like combat with a roguelike element. Your job is to escape like a dungeon scenario, and then if you die, you get sent back, and you're fighting your way back and through all of it. This is the kind of game I think could really go either way. This might be fun, it might be terrible, which is usually my experience with most roguelikes, honestly. I'm going to keep an eye on it, but not too much to say otherwise at the moment. Next up, we've got a look at Pragmata. In fact, you can actually play it via a demo for yourself right now. It's available over on Steam. But Pragmata is due out April 23rd, 2026, and this is kind of an odd one, honestly. It's kind of like a sci-fi action sort of game that's doing some interesting things with combat, and you like trying to hack robots with this young girl like on your back at the same time that you're trying to protect. It's a whole thing. It looks interesting enough. I'm not too sold on it personally just yet, but we'll see how it goes. Too much longer to wait on that one either way. I might cover the demo here in the coming weeks just to check it out for myself. Following on from that, we got one of the larger reveals for the show, which is the reveal of Star Wars Fate of the Old Republic. This was just an announcement that that game is coming. Most notably, a Star Wars game set in the Old Republic era is of note to a lot of people. People have been clamoring for something like KOTOR 3 for a long time. While this isn't literally KOTOR 3, it seems to be at least trying to perhaps replicate that a little bit. So something to know for sure, at least. We'll have to wait and see more of it before I get too excited, but glad to see it announced, if nothing else. Moving on though, then we have the Solasta 2 Early Access trailer. Always glad to see more of Solasta 2. I've been waiting on that CRPG quite some time already. It's entering Early Access on March 16th. You can certainly expect me to cover more of it there. I love Solasta 1, and I'm excited to see more of what Tactical Adventures has in store for everybody with this Early Access period. Then we had an announcement from Wizards of the Coast and D&D, actually. They gave a cinematic reveal for an upcoming game they are working on called Warlock. They plan on showing gameplay for it in the summer, followed by a 2027 release. Judging by the name and the aesthetic of the trailer and stuff they showed, it looks like this is meant to follow a Warlock from D&D around, if you believe it, which is great news for me. I love the Warlock class personally, but I'd have to see what the actual game is first before I can get too excited. Hopefully it turns out great, though. Following on from that, we then had a look at Ontos, I believe it is called. This is like a sci-fi narrative adventure, but the catch is it is made by the same people who made Soma. Soma was a really well-loved game, and honestly, just that is enough to get me interested in it personally. It is supposed to be coming sometime in 2026, and I'll definitely be keeping an eye on it. Don't know if I will necessarily review this one. Always kind of hard to tell with these kinds of games, However, it does look pretty cool. So, following on from that, we had a look at Resident Evil Requiem, which the big reveal here was that Leon Kennedy is going to be in it. It is due out for February 26th, 2026. Not much longer to wait on that one at all. I will say that compared to a lot of other Resident Evils, I really like the vibe of what they've been showing for this one. Resident Evil is not a big franchise for me personally. I know, of course, how it is beloved by a lot of people. But for whatever reason, this one specifically is speaking to me a little more than the ones in the past have. Either way, though, you'll be hearing about that one again soon, just due to its release date, either way. Following on from there, we had another extended gameplay look at the upcoming Exodus title, a game that's kind of sort of like Mass Effect. Truth be told, I haven't been keeping up with the news on this one a ton. I've just been kind of vaguely aware of the stuff that it has had going on and people mentioning it here and there. Outside of what they had to show here, it is apparently coming in 2027, which is probably no surprise. I don't think anybody was expecting that one necessarily super soon, but either way, looking pretty cool. Next up, we had a really cool reveal for me personally, which is Control Resonance, which is effectively Control 2. Control 1 was like one of my early game reviews, and I really liked it. I enjoyed that series specifically a lot, and it looks like this time we are taking up the role of Jesse Faden's brother, I believe. Excited to see what Remedy winds up doing with that one. I still need to get around to playing Alan Wake 1 and 2 though, so there is that. A curious intrigue next, we then have Gang of Dragon. So this was a game that is still a ways off from what I understand. Gang of Dragon is from one of the people who used to work on the Yakuza series, who then started their own studio, I believe. And perhaps then, unsurprisingly, Gang of Dragon does look like a slightly more serious, at least in tone, version of something like the Yakuza series. And with any luck, it manages to live up to that and find some space to be interesting all on its own. I'm up for it at the very least. Now, third from the end here, we then had, honestly, kind of a bit of a bummer for Diablo 4 for me. They announced their new expansion, the Lord of Hatred, which they will be fighting Mephisto, and they're bringing in the Paladin class. And unfortunately, thanks to what they've done with the Diablo franchise as a whole these days, I just don't find myself super excited about it. I may well take a look at it when it has time. I do not have a super long time to wait for it, as it is coming in April 28th to be specific, I believe. If my schedule allows for it, I may well take a look at it, but I mean, Diablo 4 just as a game and the direction they've gone with it since launch just has not been for me, and I don't really expect that to change with this. Followed on from that, there was a trailer for Lords of the Fallen 2. Lords of the Fallen was a really fun Souls-like when I took a look at it back towards when it released. It then went through a bunch of overhauls and stuff, and in fact, kind of annoyingly for me personally, it looks like they added some achievements for the original game to go alongside of this. Looks like they're mostly just bringing in a veteran mode from what I understand. Either way though, I did enjoy Lords of the Fallen, so I will almost certainly check out Lords of the Fallen 2. Our penultimate entry is ultimately Novelaw. Novelaw is an upcoming like cyberpunk-esque type of game. First person, action oriented. What actually caught my eye about this specifically was less the game itself and more that it was from the makers of The Ascent. Now that's interesting because The Ascent was like a top-down cyberpunk game that was really cool. It had a few things kind of keeping it from being incredible in my opinion, but it was still a really fun game, and I'm actually kind of excited to see what that studio can do from here. Definitely going on the wish list for me. And then to finally close it out, we then have Phantom Blade Zero. Now, I don't know if they had announced this previously, but last I heard, Phantom Blade Zero was meant to be a PlayStation exclusive, and it looks like they changed their mind on that, and that it is now coming to Steam. That is important because I am a PC channel, and when I thought it was just going to be a PlayStation exclusive, I really wasn't that interested, but now that I know it's actually coming to PC, I am up for it. I will be reviewing that when it releases, which we also got, 9/9/26. As for the game itself, looking very sharp, which is why I was interested in it to begin with. In particular, some of the boss fights they showed off, and some of like the animations and moves you could do look really cool to me personally. I'm actually pretty excited to play that now that I know it's coming to Steam, and I hope it manages to live up to my expectations. But that is pretty much going to do it for important announcements as far as this channel is concerned. There was, of course, other stuff. Most of it was smaller or just of no particular interest to me personally, and thus isn't something I would cover on the channel, which again matters to me personally. But if there was anything I didn't include here, of course, drop it down in the comments. Let people know what you're excited about as we start to look forward to gaming in 2026. But in the meantime, hope you're ready to close out the year with me, which is as good a time as any to remind you to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.
You'll need a top-notch team to win this one.
This woman writes, "The discourse is BS. Shut the heck up." A thread. And indeed, she's made a 7-part thread here that's now collected over 500,000
Make
views
way
in
for
the
the king of
initial
teams.
tweets.
That's a lot.
And it's now going kind of viral in gaming circles. And
What
in
does
her
it say?
views in the
Nobody is
initial
coming to
tweet,
save you.
And it's now going
Make way
No
for the king of
incels are
teams.
going to band together to create
way
an
for the
immaculately
king of teams.
gate-kept industry for you. The existential dread you grapple with has everything to do with the fact that you weren't loved enough and that most people find... That's actually not true. The incels have banded together. They're on r/Asmongold. I don't know
Yeah,
what
I
she
got more than
means.
one ace up his sleeve.
Yeah, this has already happened.
kind of viral.
What do
in
you
gaming
mean?
Circles. And in her
30
thread, she
seconds
comes
before
off
your attack.
extremely angry, very unhappy with gamers for having the audacity to criticize corrupt corporations in the gaming industry. She seems to really want to defend those corporates. She also attempts to defend DI consultation companies.
Right.
And spoiler alert, her claims are very easily
people got mad?
disproven. So she's taken an extremely unwise position here. We'll get to all that stuff. It should be a fun one. First, a little bit more context on who this even is. With 22,000 followers, she's on Twitch and YouTube, and in her bio says she's UX R&D and game and media production by day, or lore keeper by night. Providing additional information in her pin tweet, she says, "Hey new folks, I'm Ray. I work in the gaming industry in UX R&D plus game production. I worked on various software and hardware for Xbox. I now work as an independent media producer and have the privilege of working on the Dota Internationals 2023 and other gaming media projects."
Yeah?
Okay, with that context, let's return to her angry thread and see what all she has to say. She begins with part 1, saying, DEI consultation companies don't bully studios into changing creative direction. They act as resources to help creatives portray a lived experience. The Northman is an example of this. Okay, so first of
I'm
all,
sure sometimes that's true, but I'm sure sometimes it's not true. I feel like that's really what it's about. Like, sure, sometimes that makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. Like, I mean, anybody could expect it, sometimes it makes sense.
when people are talking about DEI consultation companies, they're often talking about that in reference to video games.
Yeah.
Which in her next thread, she also talks about video games. So it's odd that her example of
Is
DEI
a movie.
consultation companies not bullying studios is a movie. But whatever. Okay, just kind of funny. Allow me to address the main point, which is her claim that DEI consultation companies don't bully studios into changing creative direction. Yeah, so Ray is absolutely incorrect here. There is on-air evidence of, for example, Kim Belair of Sweet Baby Inc. advocating for creatives to essentially extort, to threaten others at their workplace, into putting part of the budget towards consultation firms.
If you're a creative person, like I did for many years, put this stuff up to your higher-ups. And if they don't see the value of what you're asking for when you ask for consultants and you ask for research, go have a coffee with your marketing team and just terrify them with the possibilities of what might happen if they don't give you what you want.
She has essentially...
That's crazy how they just say that. Like, that seems like you shouldn't have said that. Yeah, I mean, ooh, that's
Ain't ready for
not
Rogue
so
to be a
good,
winner.
huh? Man. Shit with a smile, too?
That's because people like this think they're untouchable because they're part of a group that can't be criticized. That's the reason why. They think they can say and do whatever they want because they have some kind of unique privilege.
And anytime that people isn't that racketeering? It is. It basically is.
So what happens is that they have a, there's like a whole culture around this. There's a reward structure around this. And like it's built like this, where if you don't do what they want, they then take what you're doing and then they misconstrue it into you being a bad person. Right? Because like there's an entire like industry and like apparatus that's built around necessitating this type of consultancy and this type of inclusion. And you see this happen whenever people go off of the beaten path and they go off script, like, you know, Stellar Blade, Black Myth, Wukong, and they don't follow these different paradigms, then they get in trouble.
Ain't ready for Rogue
Yep.
to be a widow.
And that's what happens. And so, like, the apparatus isn't created just by those DEI companies. It's also created by, like, journalism. And it's created by publishers as well. And, like, they all act as, like, a pipeline to make this happen. The Mafia is less subtle. That's true.
He made the same speech multiple times. I'll play another example of this. In this one, she also does this thing where she's like, haha, it's just a joke though, but not really. Seriously, you can do this.
Have them talking with marketing so that you can absolutely terrify them by telling them, here's what's going to happen if you don't do this. And
See, like, you look at, like, what this says womanize. Like, this is, what the fuck do you mean by this? What do you mean by this? Like, this is crazy. People trying to push their agenda, push their identity onto something. Amazing.
I say that sometimes, like, as a joke, to talk to marketing and scare them, but consider, honestly, the possibility that, like, those people have to sit and deal with everyone who's going to come at them if this is a mistake. They have a...
Yeah, exactly. And that's why you shouldn't listen to people like her. Is because there's a lot of people that don't like this kind of stuff, and the more that they speak out, the less people listen to her. And that's what's happening now. Is you see that more and more people are seeing this happen, and they're like, well, actually, I really don't like this. And now you see companies that are taking these people off of their branding. They're not using them. It's because these guys, they thought that the companies were on their side. I think this is a huge problem, is that, you know, like, just like DEI, like sweet baby shit. Like, they thought that the companies were operating to help them, right? That there was like a shared ideology. The company only cares about money. And if you can trick the company into thinking that doing what you want will make them make money, then they'll do what you want. But never forget that one thing causes the other. It's not like there's like oh, which came first, the chicken or the egg. No, the money is the reason why they're doing it.
Vested interest in reducing harm and of keeping the sentiment around your project positive. And there's a genuine
Ubisoft, there's Ubisoft right there. Yeah,
that's not just ethical, it's monetary. And that makes it, for a lot of people in marketing, like I was once, a genuine, valid discussion to have very, very early. And sometimes that's actually where you can find your consulting budget.
It's pretty gross how these people openly gaslight others, whether it's other people.
Well, they gaslight the companies. That's what they do.
It's harmful and unethical to not use consultation firms.
Yeah.
Isn't that convenient? Hey, if you don't use our company, if you don't pay us, we're unethical and harmful. Her claims that there's a monetary benefit.
That's exactly what they do. Is that they try to create, and this is how it happens, right? Is that they create an apparatus that necessitates their existence. And the way that happens is that the people that are involved with them are also involved with journalism. So when they're not included in the creative process, then journalists cause problems for the companies for not doing that. And you saw that with, for example, like Black Myth Wukong. I think that's probably the best recent example. Then publishers are worried about bringing on those companies because now there's a bunch of negative press about them. And so you create a feedback loop that makes the company seem like it's bad, and it's a completely, like, it's totally fake. Like, there's no actual, like, real, like, this isn't actually happening. It's just fake. And what are the chances that big corporate is going to incorporate DEI into a competitor to lower the stock price? Well, I don't know about that. If you don't hire our services, then you're gay. Well, it's, I think it's the opposite, number one. But number two, here's the problem, is that what they do is they go and they basically, like with the journalism, I think that's the worst part about it. I think the journalism and the way that it's like covered in media is way worse. And then content creators make money off the engagement farming the rage bait? Yeah, of course. Absolutely.
And the media, yeah, and again, like, they could not exist without the media creating a necessity for them to exist in. It's all part of an ecosystem.
Are also highly questionable, and that's me putting it lightly. There's been so many examples of DEI-related games lately. For example, Concord, Dustborn, S6, SK the JL, Tales of Panzer's Out, that have been absolute financial disasters.
Yep.
Back to Ray's thread, there's part 2 where she says, games are not falling apart due to conspiracy. They're falling apart due to insanely high interest rates and poor investment decisions. We're also in a recession. So what exactly is she calling a conspiracy theory? The implication seems to be that she's saying that
if games were failing because we were in a recession and because of high interest rates, that would affect all games. But it seems like only games like Concord and Assassin's Creed Shadows and games like Dustborn, for example, are being affected. So if this was a economic-wide problem, it would affect all games, but it's not. I mean, this is basic scientific method. Like, there's a control group. The control group isn't having this happen, which means that this cause isn't the reason why the change is happening. How can anybody not think like this?
High companies are not harming games in any way. That's just a conspiracy theory, in which it certainly isn't. That said, sure, they're not like solely responsible for a lot of these games' failures, but they're definitely a factor. She also said that gaming companies are falling apart due to insanely high interest rates. And her evidence backing those claims up are an image of Wikipedia where they talk about gaming industry layoffs, and a second image that talks about tech company layoffs. So
has it ever occurred to you that the layoffs are happening as an outcome of these bad games being released and not making money? Because Capcom is hiring new people. So is From Software. They just announced that they're raising salaries. So how is this like an industry? Yeah, what is this? How is this happening?
And she's essentially wrong on this because it's debatable whether high interest rates or low interest rates can be more negatively impactful to the gaming industry, but the argument for high interest rates being an issue for the gaming industry is that investment firms may seek alternative investments that are less risky. And when it comes to layoffs, the evidence that she seems to be using, the argument
is happening with all tech companies, not video game companies. Yeah, it's happening with everything.
More so that low interest rates can actually cause more video game layoffs because they potentially lead to more mergers and acquisitions, which can then lead to more redundancy and then cause layoffs. So this woman's arguments are all over the place. She really does not seem to know what she's talking about here. Oh, and she did include a third image, which is this one.
Games industry leaders brace for up to 2 years of pain. Oh my god. The only thing that's surprising to me about this is they say that it's only going to be 2 years. I think it's going to be a lot more.
Peace to this universe, no matter the cost.
This does nothing to help her at all. Now, to be fair, she also said poor investment decisions by the gaming companies.
Well, like, has it ever occurred to you that those poor investment decisions are things like Concord that are informed by criteria that don't reflect gamers, like DEI?
What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some exciting news about Larian Studios' next game in the form of Divinity, which by all accounts seems to be a Divinity 3, but we'll get to that in a moment. The title itself is just Divinity. Now, this is extremely exciting news for me in particular, not just because I love Larian Studios, but for people who have been around for my channel for a really long time. You may just remember that there was a time I was a dedicated lore channel for the Divinity series. In fact, my sign-off, May You Wander in Wisdom, comes from Jay Han. He says it to you when you exit conversation with him in Divinity Original Sin 2. To this day, if you search Divinity lore on YouTube, you will be bombarded with videos on my own channel, and I'm going to put some of that lore to use when talking about the announcement of this game, because I think there's some really interesting stuff in the trailer. But speaking of that trailer, there are really only some small parts of it that I can actually show you, because it's a very gory and graphic trailer that would get demonetized in a heartbeat, or at the very least age restricted, which is its own problem. I'm going to show some like still shots here and there, that kind of thing, but by and large I'll just link the trailer down below and I will simply talk about what is there and try to show off what I can. Now, we got all of this news from the announcement in the form of a trailer at the Game Awards last night. However, they also plugged the website for the game, which came with a press pack, which actually included some other information in a one-pager that, while not super useful to general audiences, is obviously going to put in some work here. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. So, Divinity here, while not explicitly a sequel to Original Sin or even the rest of the Divinity franchise, the press pack thing specifically mentioned that the gods are silent. That's important because Original Sin 2 ends with the gods being dead. They don't make an appearance in Divinity 2 Ego Draconis, really, where that is actually like 60 years past Original Sin 2. And when I've talked about this previously, that was actually something I really wanted from a potential game in the Divinity franchise, which is to advance the timeline, because there's a lot of unresolved stuff there that we're about to get into. However, the focus of the trailer, it is essentially like a festival taking place where a bunch of cheery, happy people are essentially burning a man alive as part of a sort of Wicker festival. As that is happening, he suddenly explodes into some sort of demonic fury, killing that guy, obviously, but then causing all sorts of mayhem, which is where the trailer itself ends. But there's a couple of things to note along the way. One, probably worth a mention that the guy has a bunch of runes carved on his chest. It's a seven-pointed star, which may be a nod to the supposed seven gods, which leads me to believe that it's a possibility, I don't know this for sure, obviously, but the person they're burning isn't necessarily human, and that's why everyone's celebrating it. Demons, in fact, have been known to take human form. We see that just in Original Sin 2, even with Adramelech, and in other games as well, though less known. Overall, like Original Sin 1 has a demon masquerading as a guy. Very common, and given the reaction when he dies, I'm inclined to believe, given the rest of the trailer and the Hellstone at the end of it, that that person doesn't seem to be human. However, I just mentioned the Hellstone. There was, leading up to the Game Awards, this big statue discovered out in the desert via, like teasers and stuff, and it was later matched up with some trademarks about Divinity, which I didn't want to cover because I was getting a little too excited about it, but that statue is what they are referring to as the Hellstone, which we see at the end of the trailer. Why is that specifically interesting? Well, it's interesting because in Divinity lore, Rivellon, as the world is known, doesn't actually have a place called Hell. There are planes of existence where like demons come from, and the eighth god Chaos was sort of banished to, if you will, by the other seven. Neither of those planes they are associated with are known specifically as Hell, though. So, I mean, it may well just be that this is a simplification for the sake of putting it out there. I just wanted to point out that, technically speaking, demons in Divinity were made by the eighth god Chaos. His compatriots' reaction to him making demons was to fight him with their collective might and seal him away in a realm that is Tartarus. The games have never explored Tartarus, but it is where the demons are actually from. They stage all of their invasions into Rivellon from another plane of existence known as Nemesis. Nemesis was a peaceful place home to a different race called the Renari, which only featured in Beyond Divinity, and didn't come up much since. However, I mentioned that that might just be a nothing burger, and the reason for that is simply that they didn't really start caring a ton about having a cohesive world and lore together until like Original Sin 1 and 2. Meaning that I think it's pretty safe to expect them to probably even retcon some of that stuff further, if they even consider it canon at this point. Either way, though, that human who is being burned, sort of like dripping into toxic power that then throws up corrupted beings of some sort, certainly seems demonic in nature to me. However, it is also possible that it might have something to do with the Voidwoken and the God King, which I can't go into great detail about without just straight up spoiling Original Sin 2, but suffice to say, the God King is the leader of the Voidwoken. He was never, like, destroyed as part of Original Sin 2, and it's very possible he has more machinations up his sleeve, and given that his form has some resemblances to what the Hellstone is meant to be, I don't think that's impossible. I mean, to be honest, maybe he even teamed up with the eighth god Chaos, which hasn't been seen in a while either, all of which are interesting possibilities. Another interesting thing I noticed about the trailer is that it seems to feature like an orc, like a guy who's drinking heavily, has like some tusks on his bottom teeth, that kind of thing. That's interesting because orcs typically have been depicted very differently throughout the Divinity franchise, and generally speaking, they have not been like playable or really involved all that much. They were in Original Sin one, I would say, more than the others. Most recently, mind you, they make appearances here and there, but typically it's been so just the fact that there's not one carousing with regular people during this festival as part of the trailer is actually more noteworthy than it might initially appear. Either way, though, truth be told, it's an announcement trailer. This game is likely quite some time away, and while I'm sure Larian knows more or less what they are doing next as they move forward, obviously we can only really speculate here. Just the fact that they're calling it the Hellstone is interesting. The fact that they are saying that the game is going to be informed by Original Sin 1 and 2, and the fact that they mentioned that the gods are silent specifically, leads me to believe that this will probably be the farthest out game in the timeline, which is what I'm hoping for. I wouldn't say it's impossible for them to have it somewhere else in the timeline. I've actually got an old video, mind you, about the series timeline, which is all over the place. They could certainly have put it somewhere else, but just from the information given, it does kind of sound like this will be farther out than Divinity 2 Ego Draconis, and if so, Damien will likely play a role. He doesn't come up too much in Original Sin 2, but he is the avatar of Chaos and a big feature of a lot of the early games. He's also kind of MIA as far as the latest timeline goes. He leaves Ego Draconis, unscathed. His plans don't go exactly according to plan, but he lives. So of the potential antagonists for the series that are like available to pull for this game, you've basically got Damien, Chaos, and the God King, who could, I think, make an appearance on top of just bringing completely new stuff to the lore. Lots of exciting possibilities, and I am absolutely pumped to cover them. However, what we do not know, and what I wouldn't be able to hazard a guess on, actually, is what genre of video game will this be? That's going to be an interesting one. So, people probably know Larian best from Baldur's Gate 3, which is a turn-based RPG. Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2 were turn-based, and while, yes, you could use their biggest hits as a means to be like, oh, the next one will probably be a big CRPG again. However, I would be remiss not to mention that of the currently 6 games in the Divinity franchise, only 2 of those were turn-based CRPGs. The original game, Divine Divinity, and its sequel, Beyond Divinity, were more like ARPGs in the vein of something like Diablo. Divinity 2 Ego Draconis was a third-person action game, and then Divinity Dragon Commander was like a real-time strategy game. So the genres for Divinity are all over the place, but if I was a betting man, I would say probably either some sort of third-person action thing. They haven't done anything like that in a while, and I could see them going back to the roots of that original game for Ego Draconis to bring the timeline forward and, of course, do something fresh themselves, or I could see them continuing down the turn-based since they've had just an insane amount of success with that. I would say those are the 2 most likely, but realistically, I mean, it could go either way. Who knows? Now, what this means for me personally and this channel. So I plan to, over the course of probably the next couple of months, give or take, go back through all of my lore videos. I have an extensive collection of lore videos for all of the Divinity games. So here's the thing. I don't necessarily know that I need to remake most of those. I stopped making them because I was kind of out of ideas and all the info was up to date. But what I will likely do is go back through them, kind of get in mind what sort of points of all that lore that I could either sharpen up focus on, redo to give people a more, up-to-date perspective, that kind of thing. The problem with that, though, even just trying to do that with the limited capacity of this announcement is a little tough. So without having more information about like when the game takes place, what it's actually going to be about, it's hard to necessarily update any of those videos with new information versus just remaking them to make them a little easier to watch, as they were very early in my YouTube career. Either way, though, I will be kind of keeping an eye out there for, what I can update, that kind of stuff. So obviously, I will be covering this more in the future. I am extraordinarily pumped for this. I have joked for years about how all of my reviews and everything were me just killing time until there was more Divinity lore to cover. So suffice to say, this game has shot up to my single most anticipated title, period. I'm going to be covering it a lot. And to that end, I certainly hope you're along for the ride. Let me know how you feel about it down in the comments section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.
We sure a long way from the Big Easy.
Before you attack, get ready.
Stand back, Ada Marie. Let's game it with this one.
What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you the games that I reviewed in 2025 that were better than I expected. As you would probably expect when you review a whole bunch of games throughout the year, some of them are bound to surprise you in enjoyable and fun ways, and that's the kind of thing that I like to highlight on this channel. But as with all of these videos, I like to start them off talking a little bit about expectations. So, truth be told, I would not really claim any of the games on this list are my personal favorites outside of like individual little categories maybe. Just that they were better than I expected, and your expectations going into a game are going to color that experience quite a bit. These expectations are going to be formed by things like marketing, previous experience with the genre, just general vibes from the art style even, and then typically that game will either meet, disappoint, or exceed whatever you thought about it going into it. Having already talked about some disappointing games I've played this year, just a few days ago really, but in the case of these games, it's always a little bit interesting because a game that I expect to be great, and it turns out to be great, has met my expectations, not exceeded them. Thus, the games on this particular list are usually games that I went into with some sort of reservation that they managed to surpass in some way, as it turns out. But all in all, I think you probably get the gist. So let's go ahead and dive fully into this, starting with a game I haven't had too much of an opportunity to talk about this year. In fact, I should probably start with the fact that I have unfortunately not played its DLCs. I haven't quite gotten around to them yet. Probably do it over the holidays, but this game is none other than Atomfall. Atomfall is interesting because on one hand, would I consider it to be like some incredible, absolute must-play experience? No, not really, actually. I would say much of the reason this game kind of caught me off guard was it was made and published by Rebellion. So Rebellion is known primarily for their Sniper Elite series, I would say. And so when I heard that they were doing like a sort of experimental action-adventure open world type thing, I was naturally a little cautious, but from what they showed of it, it looked really interesting, with the premise being that you're stranded in the wake of a nuclear disaster based off a real-life event that happened in Britain. But what makes this game unique is that, to me, playing through this one felt like a sort of one-shot tabletop game, where you're dropped into a situation and your general goal is to escape it, but how you do that is largely up to you. There's a bunch of different endings based on how you reach that goal, and then the questing and stuff is down to like leads and investigations and how you talk to people, and the entire thing made for a bit of a rough but really unique experience that I enjoyed a lot. And given that I went into it not really knowing what to expect due to the developer's past experience, it definitely exceeded my expectations. However, I will say what excites me the most about this game is not this specific game. It is that I hope Rebellion takes the framework of this, as they actually refer to the game themselves as a bit of an experiment, and they just kind of hit the ground running with it. I think this is a game where if you took these systems and iterated on them a bit, you could land on something really, really cool. I hope they continue down this path. I would be very interested in that personally. Keeping it moving, however, let's go ahead and get the obvious one out of the way, Expedition 33. I think Expedition 33 caught a lot of people off guard, and speaking for myself at least, it was a game that I had had some interest in basically as soon as it was announced. Trailers and the industry events where it was shown off. I actually did a preview of the first portion of it ahead of its release, and even then, I was into it, but I thought the combat of the game might be a little bit contentious, and otherwise it seemed pretty fun. And yet, in spite of that, it still managed to blow me away just on the strength of its narrative. Expedition 33 has an incredible story, one that I think captures a very human amount of like nuance, the cycle of grief, loss, and it's just an incredibly touching and emotional story. And on top of that, if you like a good JRPG, there's plenty of that type of combat to enjoy for yourself as well. And while the combat certainly still isn't everybody's cup of tea, the story alone makes it worth chugging through. And all of that together makes for an experience I will not soon forget, and while it is not my personal game of the year, Expedition 33 is a fantastic game, easily one of the best games that released this year, and the strength of its narrative really caught me off guard. Very impressed with what they did there, which is obviously why it's on this list. But keeping it moving, however, we then have Tainted Grail, The Fall of Avalon. The game people insist on comparing to games like Skyrim from Questline and Awakened Realms, based on, of course, their Tainted Grail property, which is a pretty big board game. game actually, and a universe that they've really been putting a lot of effort into expanding, and this particular project was one of those attempts, and I think they managed to do that very successfully. But I think if I had to say why this game exceeded my expectations, it would really be down to the fact that one of the reasons you don't see a lot of games that are just straight up like Skyrim clones these days, despite some efforts in that regard, is because that's actually a really difficult thing to do. And yet, I think this game succeeds at parts of it, not all of it certainly, while also adding its own spin and unique feel to everything, which made for an extremely enjoyable experience. I do think it falls off towards the end, even with their patch 1.1 update, which expanded Act 3 a little bit. It's definitely a little light in that regard, and yet, in spite of that, it's a ton of fun to just explore, work on your build, get to the bottom of all these different quests, and chase down the resurrection of King Arthur and get involved in that and try to figure out all these mysteries of the weird, some immaculate vibes based on just the general aesthetics of the IP even. And all told, I think this was an incredibly ambitious project for them. They had not taken on something of this scale previously, which probably accounts for some of the weaker elements of it for sure, but it's a really incredible start. So much so that I would happily play more stuff in this particular style from this IP. So much like with Adamfall, I hope they keep it up and keep working on this stuff, but it's also a really tall order, so I wouldn't blame them for not doing that either. But we'll see what happens. For our fourth entry, we actually have the first Berserker Kazan. Now, sometimes I joke when it comes to Souls-likes that, you know, I'm no Iron Pineapple or anything, and while it's basically true that there are YouTubers who like the whole thing is just covering Souls-likes, whereas me, on the other hand, I enjoy them every once in a while. I wouldn't say I play every one that comes out by any stretch, but some of them catch my eye and I just really get into the flow of it. And the first Berserker Kazan is a game I want to mention in that context because you play enough Souls-likes, you kind of get the gist, you know what I mean? A lot of these games in this genre is very similar to each other. You kind of know roughly what to expect going into it, and that certainly colors, again, what you expect of that game then. And so I think for a game to not only faithfully represent the genre, but also just be incredibly good at what it does and draw you in at the same time, meaning that it manages to feel unique in that crowded space, is really something else. And I got incredibly into this game. In particular, I love the way things like the parries feel, I love the sort of art style, the over-the-top nature of it, and I think a lot of it actually does come down to just sort of that more amorphous concept of game feel. Kazan just feels really good to play, and I think nowhere in that game does it shine more than the bosses themselves. It absolutely captures, thanks to just some small mechanics that help with it, but also just the concept at large, the idea of challenging a boss multiple times, learning, and then overcoming that challenge. And I haven't gotten that feeling out of a Souls-like in a long time. One of the things that actually helps with that, though, is a small subtle change that I alluded to, which basically is that dependent on the damage you manage to deal to a boss, it will actually give you experience for that attempt, even if you failed. This means that you can actually do that, challenge a boss over and over again, while also still earning experience and potentially leveling up, which is going to help you overcome that challenge, which makes it feel much more manageable than other games in the genre, which I think is one of the things that contributes to actually giving you that feeling. And then on top of that, basically every boss in this game felt incredibly fair. I mentioned it in my review for this one, and it was one of my more memorable gaming experiences this year, where I was fighting the final boss for like 6 hours. That was an intense boss fight, and throughout that entire experience, not one time did I feel like the game was being, again, unfair in any way. It was entirely like, I can do this if I try enough, and eventually I got it, and it felt amazing. And again, Kazan has, I think, given me feelings that genre is known for that I haven't actually gotten from that genre in quite some time, which is why it was so memorable for me. Really had a great time with it. Second to last, however, we then have Chronos: The New Dawn. Now, the reason Chronos: The New Dawn exceeded my expectations is very simple. I don't play a lot of games in this genre, and it just so happens that the one that caught my eye is really good. That genre genre being survival horror. In particular, we're kind of flung into the far future long after humanity has ended, with us having to fight these things called orphans, which are these grotesque body horror monsters. And of course, throughout the game, you get to the bottom of the what, the why. There's a bit of time traveling to past versions of the world. And throughout that journey, the story is fantastic. I was really into it. I love the art. It's a mix of like brutalist architecture and of course the sort of body horror stuff that you see with the orphans, and I thought that was really great. That's just kind of the thing that I enjoy, strangely enough. I think the mechanics of the game are well done. I don't play a ton of this genre, but I just had a really great time, doing things like managing resources, trying to find the most efficient way to tackle challenges so I could manage those resources. It did like some fun stuff with gravity mechanics here and there. And without going into too much detail about the why and potentially spoiling the game for people, I guess the simplest way to put it would just be that I don't play a lot of these games. I didn't really know what to expect going into it, and it just so happens to be a great game, and so my expectations were pretty easily exceeded, but genuinely had a great time with that one. That does bring us to our final entry, and I'm sure it will be a little bit contentious, and this is none other than Oblivion Remastered. It's no secret that I love Oblivion. It's one of my favorite games. Probably no surprise then to see it on this list, but I do want to acknowledge something, which is that the performance for this game is not where it needs to be for a lot of people. I'm well aware of that. I don't disagree. Although I will say on my end, I have not had nearly the amount of problems other people have had. This game has always ran really well for me. And so it's not really possible for me to get upset about a thing I'm just not experiencing. So I acknowledge it exists, it needs to be fixed, so, ideally other people can enjoy it. But in basically every other regard, Oblivion Remastered to me managed to thread an incredibly small needle of fixing a lot of the very obvious problems of the original Oblivion, while also improving and doing some really great stuff that made this a more enjoyable experience for everybody else. Namely, the sweeping overhauls to things like the leveling system, the more subtle changes to like varying up the amount of voice actors, but also by doing the smart thing here and keeping a lot of the other mechanics that I think add to this game's classic charm, as you'll often hear it referred to as, which is done by likely what is causing the performance issues, which is slapping a sort of Unreal Graphics engine on top of the game's like base engine, which is still running all of the Radiant AI and stuff in a sort of a Frankenstein's monster situation. And if you're not experiencing those performance problems, it's a tremendous time. In fact, just since I reviewed the game, I covered it in a separate video, but they've also fixed some of the more annoying issues I ran into with like the map constantly going to the world map even if you were in a dungeon, some of the weird like difficulty scaling for the difficulty modes they put in, and all told, like if you had asked me exactly what I would have wanted from a remaster or a remake of Oblivion, this would have been it. And in fact, I can prove that because I put out a video like a month or so before this dropped talking about some of the things that I think they could do that I thought were cool, and they included a lot of that. One of the main ones I mentioned specifically was if they were going to do like the voices and stuff, that would probably keep the iconic characters and then mix up the side characters to add a lot more variety to the voice acting without actually changing the important bits, and that's literally what they did. Then of course the leveling system. So for me, in a lot of ways, Oblivion Remastered was quite literally like somebody checked off my exact wish list for how to approach a remake or a remaster of that game. And so while the performance issues for people definitely suck, for me and what this game means to me, which you'll know all about if you've watched my original review for it, the original version, it was just such an incredible part of the year for me, which is the note I would like to leave this particular video on. So that is pretty much going to do it. I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. I would love to hear all about the games that exceeded your expectations this year, or perhaps some games that didn't quite make the cut. I'm sure some people will probably note that the year is not quite over yet, and they may think it's a little early to do this video, but personally, there's exactly one new game coming up this year that I haven't already played, so it's pretty well set in stone for me in terms of those things. But either way, I'd love to hear from you guys, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.
A nice deep freeze.
Every
What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my biggest gaming disappointments. And while that is not a subject I love to cover personally, as somebody who primarily reviews games, it is something that is just inherently going to come up, and I do think it's important to talk about every once in a while. But in this particular case, the reason I'm talking about it is because just recently, thanks to Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 and its DLC fiasco, I was reminded that sometimes things can be incredibly disappointing. Like, for instance, a horrible DLC practice that is probably going to ruin the goodwill that a game that has been through development hell really needed. In fact, with all the gameplay and everything that's coming out, I think a lot of people had kind of been cautiously optimistic that that game was going to turn out really well. And in truth, it still might in terms of gameplay, but then doing a day one DLC that locks a third of the clans off is, I think, to put it judiciously, disappointing. Which obviously got me thinking about other things in the gaming landscape that I found disappointing, which is obviously what we're doing here. Now, while typically every year I talk about the games that year that didn't really land for me and were disappointing in some way or another, this is going a little broader than that. This is just kind of all across the board, and that means you'll likely have heard me talk about one or two of these previously if you watch like every day. But these are the ones that I would say kind of stung the most. That said, though, what really tends to cause that to happen, at least for me anyway, is your expectations going into something. So there are plenty of games I don't like, but if I go into that experience kind of expecting not to like it and then I don't like it, that just kind of met my expectations. I wouldn't really call it a disappointing experience. What tends to usually be the actual case is that you go into something expecting to have a good time, and it fails to live up to those expectations in some way. The ever easy example of this is Cyberpunk 2077, especially on PC. You see, if you played that game on PC, the bugs and stuff weren't nearly as bad as they were elsewhere. But what you'd also find is that the experience overall and the games they made didn't really live up to what was advertised either, which was also, in its own way, very disappointing. And obviously they went to great lengths to fix it, and it's much better now. But it was an infamous launch that makes for an easy example, as I mentioned. Now, in my case, it just so happened that I got a taste of expectations getting out of control relatively early in my adult life, anyway. So first off, we're going to talk about Diablo 3, a game that I built up in my own head so much that it was just never going to live up to what I wanted it to be. But also, I wouldn't say Diablo 3 is outright bad. I would just say it was mostly okay, and somehow that stung worse than it being bad at the time. Now, to paint a bit of a picture here, Diablo 3 released a couple weeks before my birthday in 2012, my 19th birthday to be specific. Now that's important because that was around the time that I had finally gotten on my own 2 feet after being homeless for a couple years as a teenager. But at that time I had settled into living on my own, supporting myself, that kind of thing. And then here comes the official release of Diablo 3, a game whose development I had been following for years, kind of hearing about it on and off, but also mainly because I loved Diablo 2, as I've talked about previously as well. I played that game an honestly unhealthy amount when I was in middle school as a bit of a refuge from the outside world, as, obviously I grew up homeless as a teenager. Things weren't going well before that, and lucky me, Diablo 2 was a fantastic game that I really dove into, and as a result, I wanted the sequel to be as equally amazing, and then, I'm out here supporting myself for the first time, and Diablo 3 is about to release, and I was super into it. And as anybody who remembers Diablo 3's launch would probably tell you, it obviously failed to live up to that. There were all sorts of your typical login issues, as online-only games have always run into, and in many ways I'd actually blame this specific situation for being one of the reasons that a lot of ARPGs like this not having a single-player offline mode really bothers me these days. But also there were other things to contend with, like, the Real Money Auction House, that was its own big drama, and a bunch of other factors like the in-game and how some of the stacks of that buff that would lock you into a build and stuff. And then eventually Diablo 3 went on to grow from some of that stuff, and it turned out fine. Obviously, I'm sure it was very successful for Blizzard after all, but the big takeaway from that really is just that it was not Diablo 2, neither mechanically, visually. It didn't really feel like it was innovating on a lot of stuff, and it mostly just felt perfectly okay, and I was really bummed out about it. Kind of stopped playing it after just a couple of weeks of binging it, really, and then jumped in for a season or or two here and there over the years. That was kind of it. However, that feeling of bitter disappointment, especially after loving the previous entry so much, really stuck with me. And in many ways, it went on to, I would say, characterize how I feel about other games, because while I can certainly still get disappointed, obviously, I basically approach every game these days with a healthy dose of expectations, to where if something doesn't live up to my standards, it's a bummer, but it's not like something I need to throw a tantrum about on the internet. But while we're obviously starting out strong, we still got plenty to go, because next up we've got the Waylanders. Now, the Waylanders had a ton of potential to be an incredibly interesting CRPG that ultimately went really south really fast. So if you've never heard of the Waylanders, it was a Kickstarter CRPG, and in fact it took a lot of things from something like Dragon Age Origins. It took place across 2 different time periods, dealt with a lot of like Celtic mythology, that kind of thing. But unfortunately, when that game released, it was almost unplayable. In fact, technically speaking, it's possible to beat that game even today, but it is extremely unlikely that you will be able to, as it is an incredibly busted game. To this day, I think there's like 7 or so like side quests for like companions and things that are just straight up uncompletable. As a great many of its quests, both main and side, will just lock on you. You'll sometimes run into invisible walls that make things impassable, and it's honestly just a really horrible experience. And perhaps unsurprisingly then, I would say, the game was just outright abandoned shortly after that. I think they never even fulfilled all their Kickstarter obligations, and oftentimes you may very well hear me when I'm talking about Kickstarter projects explain that I absolutely refuse to endorse them, and this game is one of those reasons why, because even when you have a successful Kickstarter project with people that have worked in the industry for a long time, things like that, it's possible for things to go sideways, and I just frankly don't want to attach my name to something like that just has way too many variables and all of these other factors you have to take into account when choosing whether or not to to contribute to crowdfunding in that way. And simply put, it's just very volatile, and I obviously don't know those people personally, but ultimately this was so disappointing because it was a promising CRPG that failed to deliver in basically the worst way possible and was ultimately abandoned. Which brings us to our third entry, none other than Helix 2. Quite honestly, the death knell of Piranha Bytes, as it turns out, which is disappointing all on its own, but unsurprisingly, if you ever heard me talk about it, I kind of loved the original Helix, surprisingly so. I got super into that game. It's a janky, weird little mess, but man oh man, does it just hit the right chords for me. I love the first Helix. And if I had known Piranha Bytes penchant for kind of underwhelming sequels at times, outside of maybe Gothic 2, this may have caught me a little less by surprise. But Helix 2 I was obviously excited about after enjoying the first game so much, and while I went into it really wanting to enjoy it, Helix 2 is just rough in so many ways. For starters, they changed like how the game was presented in terms of like graphics and things like that. I think they changed the engine or something, and some of it looks okay, but some of it just somehow looked worse than the original game. A lot of the plot elements unfortunately don't really go anywhere either. They set you up having a son in this one after setting a canon romance from the first title as well, but your son is barely in it. In fact, I would go so far as to call the main character Jax probably one of the worst farmers in video games I've ever seen, as a matter of fact. On top of that, much of the writing across the board is pretty bad. So many of the missions turned into just like go kill X number of monsters, and that is a common enough thing across Piranha Bytes games. It is excessive here. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole host of other problems. The controls, the fact that the world itself doesn't even feel nearly as lived in as the original, as an example. And the whole thing honestly just feels rushed, and if I had to guess, it probably was. Now what makes this sting even worse though is that, like most of Piranha Bytes games, it was intended to be a trilogy, so Helix 2 is all we're ever going to get. We're never going to see whatever the third entry was, which means there are a bunch of questions left unanswered as they were deliberately setting up that third project, and going from a game where the original was incredible and the sequel was disappointing to just never getting the third one because things went so poorly, I think pretty much sums up the situation around Helix 2 about as well as I could with this explanation, as it really is just a shame to me. But that brings us to number 4. which is none other than Star Wars Jedi Survivor. Now this is one I wanted to include because it's a little different than the others. In fact, many of you might know where I'm going with this already, as I have mentioned this before in places previously already. But basically, the actual gameplay and content of Jedi Survivor is awesome. I had a great time with it. There was an extremely long puzzle platforming section that I didn't care for, but otherwise, mostly had an awesome time. But what is incredibly disappointing about Star Wars Jedi Survivor, or at least especially more so around its launch, is that it was incredible.